Welcome to the Fragments of Me. This channel shares fictional emotional stories inspired by real-life situations. All characters and events are created for storytelling and entertainment purposes only.
Look, I dumped the guy who took me back twice, and now I regret it every single day while I'm stuck here serving drinks at 2 a.m. to people who actually know how to appreciate what they have. I'm Victoria. I'm 24, and this is probably the stupidest thing I've ever done, but somehow I keep making it worse. So there I was 2 years ago, fresh out of college, working at this trendy cocktail place downtown, thinking I had the whole world figured out. That's when I met Ronald at my friend Brooke's birthday party. He wasn't the type of guy I usually went for, you know what I mean? He worked in project coordination for some construction company, had this steady job with benefits and everything, drove this reliable Honda that he actually took care of, lived in his own one-bedroom apartment that was clean and organized. My friends were all like, "Victoria, he's perfect boyfriend material and he's so into you." And honestly, that should have been my first red flag, because when has anything my friends recommended ever worked out for me? Ronald was sweet, don't get me wrong, but he was just so predictable and safe and boring. He'd plan these elaborate dinner dates at nice restaurants, bring me flowers for no reason, talk about wanting to travel together and maybe move in together someday. The way he looked at me made me feel like I was some kind of princess or something. Which was nice at first, but then it started feeling suffocating. I was 22, and I wanted excitement. I wanted guys who made my heart race and kept me guessing. Not someone who texted me good morning every single day and remembered every little thing I said. We dated for 8 months, and the whole time I felt like I was settling, like there was this whole world of amazing guys out there, and I was stuck with Mr. Reliable, who probably had our wedding planned in his head already. When I broke up with him, I told him I needed space to figure myself out and find who I really was. But honestly, I just wanted to date other people without feeling guilty about it. Ronald was devastated, like actually crying and asking what he did wrong and begging me to reconsider. He said he'd wait for me as long as it took and that he knew we were meant to be together. It was so pathetic and desperate that it actually made me feel sick to my stomach. Like, how can you respect someone who has so little self-respect? I felt bad for hurting him, but I also felt annoyed that he was making it so dramatic when we'd only been together 8 months. After I left his apartment that night, I felt this huge sense of relief, like I could finally breathe again and be myself, instead of trying to be this perfect girlfriend he thought I was. I started going out more, flirting with guys at work, downloading dating apps, basically living my best single life. For the first few months, it was amazing. I was dating this guy who played in a band, hooking up with this bartender from across town, just having fun and not worrying about anyone's feelings but my own. But then winter came, and all my friends were coupled up, and I started feeling lonely on the weekends when I wasn't working. The band guy turned out to be a total player who was seeing like 3 other girls, and the bartender was fun but had zero ambition and still lived with his parents at 26. I started thinking about Ronald and how he always made sure I got home safe, how he'd bring me soup when I was sick, how he actually listened when I talked about my day. I missed having someone who genuinely cared about me, someone I could count on to be there. But I told myself I was just being weak and nostalgic, that I'd made the right choice, and I just needed to find someone better. Except everyone I met was either emotionally unavailable or immature or just looking for something casual, and here I was realizing that maybe steady and reliable wasn't the worst thing in the world. By month 6, I was seriously reconsidering everything, wondering if I'd made a huge mistake, but too proud to admit it. 6 months after our breakup, I was having one of those nights where everything felt wrong and I was lonely and maybe a little drunk from the wine I'd had at dinner with Brooke. She kept talking about how happy she was with her boyfriend and asking if I was seeing anyone serious. And I realized I hadn't had a real relationship since Ronald. I was scrolling through my phone looking at all these random guys I'd been texting, and none of them felt important or meaningful. Just distractions. That's when I saw Ronald's name in my contacts, and before I could talk myself out of it, I sent him a text saying I'd been thinking about him and asking how he was doing. He responded within 5 minutes, which should have told me everything I needed to know about how he'd been spending his Saturday night. We started texting back and forth, and it felt so easy and comfortable, like no time had passed at all. He told me he'd missed me and thought about me every day, that he'd been hoping I'd reach out when I was ready. When I suggested we meet for coffee, he said yes immediately. No games, or making me wait, or acting like he was too cool to care. We met the next day, and seeing him again made me remember why my friends thought he was such a catch. He looked good, maybe even better than before. And he was genuinely happy to see me without being weird or bitter about how things ended. Over coffee, he told me he'd been working on himself, taking some classes, hanging out with friends more, basically doing all the things I'd said he should do to be more interesting. I felt this wave of guilt because he'd actually listened to my criticism and tried to improve himself while I'd been out there making terrible decisions with terrible guys. When he said he'd never stopped caring about me and would love to try again, I felt this relief, like finally here was someone who actually wanted to be with me for real. We started dating again, and Ronald was even more attentive than before, clearly trying to prove he deserved another chance. He planned better dates, was more spontaneous, even started going to the gym and dressing differently. For a while it felt perfect, because I had all the security and stability I'd missed, plus he was making an effort to be more exciting. But after a few months, that old feeling started creeping back in, that sense that I was too young to be this settled and predictable. I'd be at work, and these attractive guys would flirt with me, and I'd remember what it felt like to have that spark with someone new. Or I'd see my single friends going on adventures and dating different people, and I'd feel jealous of their freedom. Ronald would talk about moving in together and meeting each other's families, and I'd panic because it felt like my life was being planned out for me. I started finding little things about him annoying, how he always wanted to know my schedule, how he'd get quiet when other guys talked to me, how he assumed we'd spend every weekend together. The worst part was, I could tell he was trying so hard to make me happy. And it just made me feel trapped, because I knew I was being ungrateful, but I couldn't help how I felt. I started going out with friends more without inviting him, staying late at work to avoid making plans, basically pulling away without being honest about why. After 10 months together the second time, I was feeling that same suffocated feeling, but worse, because now I knew I was repeating the same pattern and hurting someone who didn't deserve it. But instead of being mature about it, I just kept pulling away until we had this huge fight about how distant I'd been. That's when I broke up with him again, telling him I realized I'd never love him the way he loved me, and that I needed someone who challenged me more. Ronald was completely destroyed this time, like I'd literally broken his heart into pieces, and seeing him that devastated made me feel like the worst person alive. He asked if there was someone else, and I lied and said no, even though I'd been texting with this guy Damon from work and having these intense conversations that made me feel alive again. For a few weeks after the breakup, I kept sending Ronald mixed signals, texting him when I was lonely or drunk, showing up at places I knew he'd be, basically keeping him on the hook because I wasn't sure about my decision. Then one night, I had this terrible date with some guy from a dating app who turned out to be a complete creep, and I showed up at Ronald's door, crying about how dating was awful, and I missed what we had. Like the idiot he was, he took me back again, held me while I cried, told me everything would be okay and we could take it slow this time. The third time we got back together only lasted 4 months, because that's when I really started getting involved with Damon. He was this server at this upscale restaurant downtown, and everything Ronald wasn't. Unpredictable, charming, had this edge that made me feel like I was living in a movie instead of real life. Damon was the kind of guy who rode a motorcycle and had tattoos and made me feel like the most desirable woman in the world when he looked at me. We started talking during my shifts when he'd come in after his restaurant closed. And these conversations were so intense and flirty that I'd get butterflies just thinking about seeing him. He'd tell me about all these crazy adventures he'd been on, places he'd traveled, people he'd met, and it made my life with Ronald feel so small and boring in comparison. At first, it was just talking, but then Damon started suggesting we meet for coffee during the day, then drinks after work, and I told myself it was just friendship, even though I knew I was lying. The way Damon looked at me was so different from Ronald. It was hungry and exciting, and made me feel like I was someone worth pursuing, instead of someone who was just convenient and available. When things got physical with Damon, I told myself that Ronald and I weren't really compatible anyway. That I was too young to settle for comfortable love, when I could have this passionate connection with someone who actually excited me. Ronald could tell something was different, but he trusted me completely, which made me feel even worse about what I was doing. I started picking fights with Ronald over stupid things because I felt guilty, and also because I wanted an excuse to break up with him without having to admit I was cheating. The final straw came when Damon told me he was falling for me and wanted us to be together for real, that he couldn't stand watching me waste my time with someone who didn't appreciate how amazing I was. So I broke up with Ronald for the third time, and this time I told him I'd met someone else because I wanted to be honest for once. Ronald completely lost it, called me selfish and immature, said he was done being my backup plan and that I'd regret throwing away what we had for some guy who would probably break my heart. He blocked my number and told me never to contact him again, which honestly felt like a relief because finally I could stop feeling guilty and just enjoy this amazing thing with Damon. Looking back now, I can see that Ronald was right about everything. But at the time, I just felt angry that he was trying to make me feel bad for choosing happiness over settling. I convinced myself that what Damon and I had was real love, that the intensity and passion proved we were meant to be together, and that Ronald was just bitter because he knew he could never make me feel the way Damon did. For the first few weeks after the breakup, I felt like I was finally living my real life. Like I'd been pretending to be someone else with Ronald, and now I could be myself. Damon and I were inseparable, staying up all night talking, going on spontaneous adventures, having this connection that felt deeper than anything I'd experienced before. I thought I'd finally found what real love was supposed to feel like. The relationship with Damon started off like a fairy tale, but turned into my worst nightmare pretty quickly. At first, the intensity was intoxicating. He'd show up at my work with flowers, take me on midnight rides on his motorcycle, write me these long texts about how I was the most incredible woman he'd ever met. But then that same intensity became suffocating in a completely different way than Ronald's love had been. Damon was possessive and jealous, getting angry when male customers flirted with me at work, showing up unannounced to check on me, going through my phone when he thought I wasn't looking. The unpredictability that had attracted me became exhausting because I never knew which version of him I was going to get. Some days he'd be this charming, attentive boyfriend who made me feel like a queen, and other days he'd disappear for hours without explanation, ignore my calls, then show up acting like nothing happened. He was completely unreliable with money, always asking to borrow cash for gas or his phone bill, couldn't seem to hold down a steady job for more than a few months. I found myself constantly stressed and walking on eggshells, trying to figure out what mood he was in and how to avoid setting him off. When I tried to talk to him about his behavior, he'd flip it around and make me feel like I was being too needy or controlling. Like I was lucky he'd put up with me at all. My friends started avoiding me because every conversation turned into me complaining about Damon, or making excuses for why he'd stood me up or been rude to them. The worst part was that the highs were still so high that I convinced myself this was what real passion looked like, that the drama and intensity meant we had something special that boring couples like Ronald and I never could. I started lying to my friends and family about how things were going because I was embarrassed by how much I was tolerating. But I also believed that fighting for love meant accepting the bad with the good. Damon would mess up and then apologize with these grand gestures that made me feel like we were in some epic love story. like our problems just proved how much we meant to each other. I was working extra shifts to cover for his financial irresponsibility, canceling plans with friends when he decided he wanted to see me, basically reorganizing my entire life around his chaos. After about 6 months, I realized I was miserable most of the time, but I'd invested so much in the relationship that leaving felt impossible. Then I started hearing rumors at work that Damon was flirting with other servers, staying late to talk to this new girl Jess who'd just started working at his restaurant. When I confronted him about it, he made me feel crazy for being suspicious, said I was being paranoid and insecure, that if I didn't trust him, maybe we shouldn't be together. But I could feel him pulling away, and it made me desperate to prove I was enough for him, that I was worth fighting for. I started dressing differently, being more available, basically turning myself inside out, trying to get back the attention he'd given me in the beginning. 8 months into our relationship, I found out from a coworker that Damon and Jess had been seen making out at some bar across town, and when I confronted him, he didn't even deny it. Instead, he told me that I'd become too clingy and needy, that he felt suffocated by my constant need for reassurance, and that maybe we both needed to see other people. The breakup happened at our workplace in front of everyone, with him basically telling me I was pathetic for caring so much about a relationship that had never been that serious to begin with. I was completely humiliated and emotionally destroyed, realizing I'd given up the best thing in my life for someone who had never really cared about me at all. After Damon destroyed me, I spent 3 months in this weird fog of depression and regret, working double shifts to avoid thinking about how stupid I'd been. That's when I started really missing Ronald and realizing what I'd thrown away for absolutely nothing. I'd check his social media obsessively, hoping to see that he was miserable without me, but instead I found out he was dating someone new. Her name was Megan, and she was everything I wasn't. A kindergarten teacher with this sweet smile and wholesome vibe, the kind of girl who probably never broke anyone's heart or cheated or made terrible decisions. Her Instagram was full of cute couple photos, with Ronald looking genuinely happy in a way I didn't remember him ever looking with me. They went on hiking trips and farmers market dates and had these cozy Sunday mornings that looked like something out of a magazine. Seeing them together made me realize that Ronald had been capable of excitement and adventure all along. I just hadn't brought out that side of him because I was too busy looking for problems. Megan seemed to appreciate all the things about Ronald that I'd taken for granted. His stability, his kindness, his devotion to the people he cared about. In every photo, he looked relaxed and confident, like he'd finally found someone who saw his worth, instead of constantly making him prove it. After watching them be happy for a few weeks, I couldn't stand it anymore, and I called him, thinking maybe if I apologized and explained how much I'd grown and learned from my mistakes, he'd give me another chance. When Ronald answered, he was polite but cold, like he was talking to an acquaintance instead of someone he'd once planned a future with. He told me he was happy with Megan and had moved on, that he wished me well, but there was no chance of us getting back together. I tried explaining that what we had was special, and that I'd just been too immature to appreciate it, but he cut me off and said he'd learned not to waste time on people who didn't value what they had. Over the next few months, I kept trying different approaches, showing up at places I knew he'd be, sending heartfelt texts about how sorry I was, even reaching out to his friends to see if they'd put in a good word for me. But Ronald had completely closed that door, and seeing him with Megan just emphasized how much better his life was without me in it. Every time I saw them around town, they looked more settled and happy, like they were building something real, while I was stuck in the same patterns that had ruined everything good in my life. I started hearing through mutual friends that Ronald and Megan had moved in together, adopted a dog, were talking about getting engaged. Meanwhile, I was going on terrible dates with guys who reminded me why Ronald had been special, trying to recreate what we'd had with people who didn't care about me half as much as he had. The worst part was realizing that I'd trained myself to be unsatisfied with genuine love because I thought drama and uncertainty were more exciting than peace and security. Now here I am, 2 years later, working until 2 a.m., serving cocktails to couples who actually know how to appreciate what they have. And I think about Ronald every single night. I watch these happy couples on dates, and I remember what it felt like to have someone who planned special evenings just to see me smile, someone who brought me soup when I was sick, and listened to me complain about work without trying to fix everything. My dating life has been a series of disappointments. Guys who ghost me after a few weeks, players who just want something casual, emotionally unavailable men who remind me why having someone consistent and caring was actually a gift. Last month I saw Ronald and Megan at the grocery store, and they had this easy, comfortable dynamic that made my chest hurt, because I knew I could have had that if I hadn't been so determined to sabotage my own happiness. They were laughing about something while picking out vegetables, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And Ronald had this contentment about him that I'd never seen when we were together. I hid behind the cereal aisle like a coward and watched them for a few minutes, realizing they were probably planning dinner together in their shared home with their shared life and shared future. When I got home to my studio apartment that night, I cried for the first time in months. Not just because I missed Ronald, but because I missed the version of myself that had been loved that completely. My friends have stopped listening to my complaints about missing him because they warned me multiple times that I was taking him for granted. And now when I bring him up, they just give me these looks like I made my bed. And now I have to lie in it. Every shift at work, I serve drinks to couples celebrating anniversaries and engagements. And I wonder what would have happened if I'd been mature enough to appreciate love when I had it instead of always looking for something better. Last week, I heard through the grapevine that Ronald proposed to Megan, and they're planning a wedding for next fall. And I literally had to go cry in the walk-in cooler because the finality of it hit me so hard. I keep telling myself that if Ronald really loved me, he would have fought harder, that he gave up too easily, that a real man would have waited longer for me to figure things out. But deep down, I know that's garbage because I had 3 chances with someone who would have built a beautiful life with me, and I threw it away for people who treated me like I was disposable. Now I'm stuck serving drinks until 2 a.m., going home alone to scroll through social media and torture myself with updates about Ronald and Megan's perfect life, wondering if I'll ever find someone who cares about me the way he did. The terrible truth is that I probably won't, because I trained myself to be bored by devotion and excited by dysfunction. And now I'm 24 years old, starting over with the knowledge that I already had my shot at real love, and I blew it. Every night when I close the bar and drive home alone, I think about texting Ronald one more time. But I know his number is blocked, and even if it wasn't, what would I say that I haven't already said? I had everything I needed to be happy, and I convinced myself it wasn't enough. And now I get to live with that choice while watching him be happy with someone who was smart enough to see his worth from the beginning.